Whether you're planning to study at a university, college, or learn a specialized trade, figuring out the financial side of paying for school and managing your finances while studying can be a challenge. Tuition, books, student fees, transportation, housing, and other expenses require a large financial investment. For most students, personal savings will not be enough to cover these costs. Students often rely on student loans for financial support. Student loans can be helpful, but students should aim to graduate with as little debt as possible. This is the definition of education funding based on the Canada.ca, which is a government website. In many countries, school is free, but there are additional costs for uniforms, books, and transportation, especially in rural areas. Overcrowded classrooms, broken desks, no computers, are all common sights in school districts with budgets that don't meet students' needs. Teachers burn out or may be unqualified to teach certain subjects. All these challenges create a serious disadvantage for children growing up in poor households. According to a study released by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives and Save the Children in Canada, Indigenous children in Canada are over 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty than non-Indigenous children. The average child poverty rate for all Indigenous children in Canada is 40%, compared to 15% for non-Indigenous children. According to David MacDonald, a senior economist with the CCPA and co-author of the study, the average child poverty rate for all Indigenous children in Canada is 40%, compared to 15% for non-Indigenous children. Regionally, the situation is even worse in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where 2 out of 3 status First Nations children live in poverty. The issue with the majority of these schools is that they are grossly underfunded. Paul Martin has stated to the Toronto Star that the per capita funding for a First Nations child going to elementary or high school is anywhere from 20 to 40% lower than what non-native kids get on a per capita basis. The strong difference between these two communities reveals a significant problem for the Canadian population overall. The strong difference between these two populations is because of the participation, socialization, and investment. While the Indigenous people live in a community that is influenced by the high alcohol consumption and the dropout background, the Canadian people are surrounded by a social frame that motivates them to pursue their education. For example, Canadians mostly tend to attend extracurricular activities, such as sports, arts, and group activities, that motivates them to engage at the school. According to Canada's statistics, there is a positive correlation between the participation into school extracurricular activities and the school results achieved. But the cost of not educating First Nations people in Canada is high. According to the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Peoples, Aboriginal poverty will cost Canada up to $11 billion per year. This could be detrimental to the Canadian economy, especially when there will be an employee shortage and many industries will be struggling to look for skilled workers. Now, all these can lead to the cycle of poverty. The cycle of poverty begins when a child is born into a poor family. These families often have limited or no resources to create opportunities to advance themselves, which leaves them stuck in the poverty trap. How does the poverty cycle affect children? Children are most affected by the cycle of poverty. Children are dependent on their guardians and therefore can't pull themselves out of poverty because of the young age and lack of resources. And what do you think can break this cycle of poverty? Yes, education. One of the biggest contributors to ending poverty is ensuring children have an education. For any child, education can open doors to the future that would otherwise be locked tight. Children who are not in school are at greater risk of exploitation and early marriage. They are on track for much lower income once they grow up. This limits the future for their own children, thus repeating the cycle of poverty generation after generation. Now, many corporate leaders in Canada are on board. They realize that closing the native education gap could add much needed fuel to the economy. The long-term future, not only of our native peoples, but of this country, is education. With education, the indigenous people can become more skilled and occupy the vacant jobs needed for the country, and develop the country and make a better life for themselves in the future.